December 24, 1943. Camp Hearne, Texas. Sergeant Antonio Russo pressed his face against the cold wire fence, staring out at the vast emptiness of the Texas prairie stretching endlessly before him. At 28 years old, this former baker from Naples had traveled further from home than he ever imagined possible, but not in the way he had dreamed as a boy. 6 months earlier, he had been fighting in the North African desert under Rommel's command. Now he wore the faded gray uniform of a prisoner of war, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers in a place so foreign it might as well have been another planet. The air smelled different here, dry and clean, nothing like the humid salt air of the Mediterranean. As the winter sun began to set, casting long shadows across the compound, Antonio noticed unusual activity near the mess hall. American soldiers were unloading crates from trucks, more supplies than he had seen in weeks. The kitchen staff seemed energized, almost excited. He did not know it yet, but he was about to experience something that would fundamentally challenge everything he believed about his captors, his enemy, and the nature of this war that had torn his world apart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Antonio Russo had never wanted to be a soldier. His father, Giuseppe Russo, owned a small bakery in the Spaccanapoli district of Naples, where Antonio had spent his childhood learning to knead dough before dawn, shaping loaves with hands that grew strong from the work. The bakery had been in the Russo family for 3 generations, and Antonio had assumed he would spend his life there, eventually taking over from his father, perhaps marrying Maria, the girl from the flower shop 2 streets over who smiled at him every morning when she passed by. But Mussolini had other plans for young Italian men. In 1940, when Antonio was 25, his conscription notice arrived. His mother, Francesca, had wept for 3 days. His father said nothing, but Antonio saw the fear in the old man's eyes. They both knew men who had gone to Abyssinia, to Albania, to Greece. Some had returned. Many had not. Antonio's military training had been rushed and inadequate. The Italian army in 1940 was poorly equipped, undersupplied, and stretched thin across multiple fronts. He was assigned to the 132nd Armored Division Ariete, one of Italy's few mechanized units, though calling it mechanized was generous. Their tanks were outdated, their trucks constantly breaking down, and their supplies arrived irregularly if they arrived at all. Despite this, Antonio found unexpected friendships among his fellow conscripts. There was Marco Bellucci, a fisherman's son from Sicily, with a quick wit and an endless supply of jokes that kept morale up even during the hardest times. There was Luca Conti, a quiet factory worker from Turin, who rarely spoke but could fix anything mechanical with just a piece of wire and determination. And there was Father Domenico Ferrara, their unit chaplain, a Franciscan priest from Rome who had volunteered for military service to provide spiritual comfort to young men far from home. The 4 of them had formed a tight bond during their deployment to North Africa in early 1941. The Desert War had been brutal in ways Antonio could never have imagined. The heat during the day was crushing, temperatures reaching 50 degrees Celsius, turning their tanks into ovens. At night, the temperature would plummet, leaving them shivering in thin blankets. Water was more precious than ammunition. Sand got into everything, their food, their weapons, their lungs. Antonio learned to wrap cloth around his face, to move slowly to conserve energy, to find shade wherever possible. The fighting itself came in sudden, terrifying bursts. British tanks would appear on the horizon, and chaos would erupt. Artillery shells screamed overhead. Machine gun fire kicked up sand. Men died confused and afraid, calling for their mothers in their final moments. Antonio had killed enemy soldiers, though he tried not to think about it. They were just shapes in the distance, targets to be eliminated. If he thought of them as men with families, with sweethearts waiting at home, with dreams of their own, he would not have been able to pull the trigger. By 1943, the North African campaign was collapsing. German and Italian forces were being pushed back on all fronts. Supply lines had been cut, reinforcements never arrived. The men were starving, disease-ridden, exhausted. On May 13, 1943, the final Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. Antonio and approximately 275,000 other Axis soldiers became prisoners of war. The British processed them first, sorting through the massive numbers, documenting identities, separating officers from enlisted men. Antonio remembered standing in endless lines under the scorching sun, waiting for water, waiting for food, waiting to learn his fate. The British guards were professional but distant. They provided basic necessities but nothing more. Antonio spent 3 weeks in a temporary camp near Tunis, sleeping on the ground, eating thin soup and hard biscuits. Then came the announcement that certain prisoners would be transported to the United States. America had entered the war in December 1941, and by 1943, hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners were being shipped across the Atlantic to camps throughout the American interior. The logic was simple: keeping prisoners far from the fighting reduced the burden on Allied forces in combat zones, and America had vast empty spaces perfect for housing enemy soldiers. Antonio boarded a transport ship in late June 1943, along with 2,000 other Italian prisoners. Marco, Luca, and Father Domenico were with him, a small mercy in an uncertain situation. The voyage across the Atlantic took 3 weeks. The prisoners were housed in the ship's hold, packed tightly together, the air thick and stale. Many became seasick. Some developed fevers. 2 men died during the crossing, their bodies committed to the sea with brief prayers from Father Domenico. When they finally arrived at Norfolk, Virginia, Antonio got his first glimpse of America. The harbor was enormous, filled with more ships than he had ever seen in one place. Massive cranes loaded and unloaded cargo with mechanical efficiency that demonstrated industrial capacity beyond anything Italy possessed. The prisoners were processed again, fingerprinted, photographed, given medical examinations. American soldiers guarded them, but these guards seemed different from the British. Younger, less formal, some looked barely old enough to shave. They chewed gum constantly, and spoke in an accent Antonio found impossible to understand at first. From Norfolk, the prisoners were loaded onto trains for transport to their final destinations. Antonio's group was assigned to Camp Hearne in Texas, one of dozens of POW camps being constructed across the American South and Midwest. The train journey took 4 days, traveling through landscapes that stunned Antonio with their variety and scale. They passed through green forests, across wide rivers, through small towns that looked prosperous and untouched by war. People in these towns would sometimes gather to watch the prisoner trains pass, their faces showing curiosity more than hatred. Children waved, which confused Antonio. How could children wave at enemy soldiers? Camp Hearne sat on approximately 1,500 acres of Texas prairie, surrounded by double barbed wire fences and guard towers positioned at regular intervals. The camp could house up to 4,800 prisoners, though the population fluctuated as men were transferred to work details or other facilities. The barracks were simple wooden structures, each housing about 50 men in double-deck bunks. There was a mess hall, a recreation area, a small chapel, and a medical facility. The compound included a vegetable garden, where prisoners could grow supplementary food, and a workshop area for various trades. By American standards, the camp was basic. By the standards Antonio had experienced in North Africa, and during his capture, it was surprisingly comfortable. The Geneva Convention governed the treatment of prisoners of war, and the Americans, at least officially, took these obligations seriously. Prisoners received the same rations as American soldiers, though Antonio did not know this initially.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
They were allowed to receive mail and send letters home, though delivery was slow and censored. They could not be forced to perform labor that directly supported the war effort, but they could volunteer for work programs that paid small wages in camp scrip. The camp operated under a system of self-governance, with Italian officers maintaining command structure and discipline among the enlisted prisoners. This created its own problems, as fascist true believers clashed with men who had grown disillusioned with Mussolini's regime. Antonio arrived at Camp Hearne in early July 1943, just as the Texas summer heat reached its peak. The landscape reminded him slightly of North Africa, all flat open spaces and relentless sun, though here at least there was grass and occasional trees. The first weeks were an adjustment period. The prisoners established routines, learned the camp rules, figured out how to navigate relationships with guards and each other. Antonio volunteered for kitchen duty, hoping to use his baking skills. The camp commander, Colonel Richard Hayes, approved the request. Hayes was a career officer in his mid-50s, a veteran of the First World War who ran the camp with firm but fair authority. He believed that keeping prisoners productively occupied reduced tensions and disciplinary problems. The kitchen became Antonio's domain. The head cook was a corporal named William Tucker, a black man from Louisiana who had worked as a chef in civilian life before being drafted. Tucker was initially skeptical of having an Italian prisoner in his kitchen, but Antonio's skills quickly won him over. Antonio could make bread from almost nothing, could stretch ingredients to feed more people than seemed possible, could turn basic rations into meals that at least resembled real food. Tucker taught Antonio about American cooking, strange dishes with names like meatloaf and macaroni and cheese. Antonio taught Tucker techniques from Italian cuisine, ways of using herbs and garlic that were foreign to American palates. A friendship developed between them, built on mutual respect and shared love of food. Marco found work in the camp garden, where his knowledge of growing things in difficult conditions proved valuable. Luca joined the motor pool, repairing trucks and equipment for the camp administration. Father Domenico established a small chapel in a corner of the recreation hall, where he held services for Catholic prisoners and offered counsel to men struggling with captivity. The four friends maintained their bond, meeting each evening after work to share news, play cards, and remind each other of home. These conversations were their anchor, keeping them connected to the lives they had left behind and hoped to return to someday. Life in the camp settled into a rhythm. The prisoners woke at 6, ate breakfast at 7, worked or attended classes until noon, had lunch, resumed activities until 5, then ate dinner and had free time until lights out at 10. The work was not hard, certainly easier than combat or even the manual labor many had done in civilian life. The food was adequate, bland by Italian standards but filling. The guards maintained professional distance, neither friendly nor hostile. Some prisoners attempted escape, but Texas was a difficult place to hide, and most were recaptured within days. The punishment for escape attempts was usually solitary confinement, not execution, another mercy that surprised many prisoners. What struck Antonio most profoundly was the abundance. America seemed to have everything in quantities that defied belief. The guards ate well, their uniforms were new, their equipment functioned properly. Supply trucks arrived regularly, always full, never late. The waste shocked him. Food that would have been precious in Italy was sometimes thrown away. Broken equipment was replaced rather than repaired. This was an economy operating at full capacity, untouched by bombing, blockade or shortage. Antonio began to understand why Italy had lost in North Africa. You could not fight this kind of industrial might with outdated tanks and courage alone. As summer turned to autumn, Antonio noticed changes in how the guards interacted with prisoners. Initial wariness began to relax. Some guards would chat with prisoners during work details, asking about Italy, sharing photos of their own families. A few spoke Italian, descendants of immigrants who had left the old country a generation earlier. These men served as informal translators and cultural bridges. One guard, Private First Class Salvatore DeMarco, was from New Jersey. His grandparents had emigrated from Calabria in 1905. DeMarco would bring Antonio newspapers with news from Italy, always old and heavily censored, but still a connection to home. Through these papers, Antonio learned that Allied forces had invaded Sicily in July, that Mussolini had been overthrown in a coup in late July, that Italy had surrendered to the Allies on September 8. The Italian surrender created a crisis within Camp Hearne. Some prisoners celebrated, believing the war was over for them. Others, hardcore fascists loyal to Mussolini, viewed the surrender as betrayal and vowed to continue fighting. The camp divided into factions. Fights broke out in the barracks. The American administration separated the most troublesome fascists, transferring them to camps designed for hardcore enemy soldiers. Those who remained, including Antonio and his friends, were men ready to accept that the war was lost, men who just wanted to survive and go home. The surrender also changed their legal status. Italy was no longer an enemy, but a co-belligerent, fighting alongside the Allies against Germany. In theory, this should have meant immediate release, but the logistics were impossible. There were tens of thousands of Italian prisoners scattered across America, no ships to transport them home, and Italy itself was a battlefield. So they remained in camps, their status ambiguous, waiting for the war to end. November arrived, bringing cooler weather to Texas. Antonio had been in captivity for 6 months, long enough that routines felt normal, long enough that the sharp edge of homesickness had dulled to a constant ache. He thought of Maria less frequently now, though guilt accompanied this realization. He wondered if she was thinking of him, if she was waiting, or if she had moved on with her life. His letters home received no replies, not unusual given the chaos of war and disrupted postal systems, but the silence weighed on him. On November 20th, Colonel Hayes made an unusual announcement during the evening roll call. In 4 days America would celebrate Thanksgiving, a national holiday commemorating the first harvest feast shared between English colonists and native peoples in 1621. The camp kitchen would prepare a traditional Thanksgiving dinner for all prisoners. This was not required by the Geneva Convention, Hayes explained, but it reflected American values of gratitude and plenty. The prisoners received this news with confusion. What was this holiday? Why were the Americans feeding them a feast? Surely this was propaganda, a trick of some kind. Antonio discussed it with Marco, Luca, and Father Domenico that evening. Marco joked that the Americans probably planned to poison them all at once. Luca suggested it was a psychological operation designed to make them soft. Father Domenico, more thoughtful, wondered if perhaps the Americans simply celebrated differently than Italians, that their generosity reflected cultural values alien to European thinking. Antonio remained skeptical but curious. He worked in the kitchen, so he would see firsthand what was being prepared. The preparations began 3 days before Thanksgiving. Supply trucks arrived carrying quantities of food that seemed impossible. Whole turkeys, dozens of them, each weighing 15 to 20 pounds. Sacks of potatoes, crates of fresh vegetables, bags of flour and sugar. Corporal Tucker directed operations with military precision, assigning tasks, organizing workspace, ensuring everything would be ready in time. Antonio was tasked with making bread, lots of bread, enough to feed nearly 4,000 men. Tucker showed him the American method, soft white bread, very different from the crusty Italian loaves Antonio was used to making, but he adapted quickly. Other prisoners were brought in to help with food preparation. German prisoners from a separate compound were assigned to peel potatoes, all of them looking as confused as the Italians about this strange American holiday. Tucker explained Thanksgiving as he worked, his Louisiana accent thick but his enthusiasm clear. He described a holiday centered on gratitude, on acknowledging blessings, on coming together with family and community to share abundance. He talked about his own childhood, Thanksgivings in Louisiana, big family gatherings with aunts and uncles and cousins, tables groaning with food, everyone contributing something. The holiday transcended individual hardship, Tucker said. It was about recognizing that even in difficult times, there were things to be grateful for. Antonio listened, kneading dough, thinking about this concept. Italy had religious feast days, celebrations tied to saints and harvests, but nothing quite like what Tucker described. The idea of institutionalizing gratitude seemed distinctly American, a reflection of abundance so consistent that giving thanks required formal scheduling. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and clear. The prisoners woke to unusual smells drifting from the kitchen, roasting turkey, baking bread, spices they could not identify. The camp buzzed with anticipation, mixed with suspicion. At noon, the call came for the first group to report to the mess hall. Antonio, exhausted from cooking since 5 in the morning, joined the line with Marco, Luca, and Father Domenico. They entered the mess hall and stopped, stunned by what they saw. The long tables were decorated with autumn leaves and small American flags. Each place setting included real plates, not the usual metal trays, and actual silverware. But what dominated everything was the food. Mountains of sliced turkey, golden brown and glistening. Huge bowls of mashed potatoes swimming in butter. Gravy boats filled with rich brown sauce. Stuffing, a bread-based dish Antonio had never encountered. Sweet potatoes topped with melted marshmallows, a combination so strange Antonio thought surely someone had made a mistake. Cranberry sauce, tart and sweet. Green beans cooked with bits of bacon, freshly baked rolls, Antonio's own work. And pies, so many pies, pumpkin, apple, pecan, desserts in quantities that seemed obscene. American guards served the prisoners, filling their plates with generous portions, encouraging them to take more, to go back for seconds. This was not prison food. This was a feast that would have been impressive in peacetime, let alone during a world war. Antonio sat down with his plate piled high, staring at the food, unsure where to begin. Around him, other prisoners wore similar expressions of disbelief. Marco took a tentative bite of turkey, his eyes widening. Luca sampled the mashed potatoes and gravy, nodding slowly in approval. Father Domenico ate in silence, his face thoughtful. Antonio tasted everything, the flavors strange but undeniably good. The turkey was moist and flavorful, nothing like the stringy chicken they occasionally received. The stuffing was savory and complex. The sweet potatoes confused his palate, dessert and side dish combined, but he found himself liking it. The gravy was rich and perfectly seasoned. The bread was his own, and he felt pride seeing others enjoy it. As the meal continued, the atmosphere in the mess hall began to shift. Initial suspicion gave way to appreciation. Men who had not smiled in months began to laugh. Conversations grew animated. Some prisoners wept quietly, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness. Colonel Hayes moved through the hall, stopping at tables, wishing prisoners a happy Thanksgiving through translators. He explained that this meal was the same meal being served to American soldiers around the world, that in feeding prisoners this way, America was honoring its values of dignity and plenty. Antonio watched Hayes, trying to understand this man who fed his enemies as honored guests. It did not make sense according to anything Antonio had been taught about war, about enemies, about how nations treated those they had defeated. After the main meal, the pies were served. Antonio had never tasted pumpkin pie before. The spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, reminded him of Italian Christmas cookies, but the texture was creamy and smooth, the sweetness balanced by the spice. The apple pie was warm, served with vanilla ice cream that melted into the filling. The pecan pie was intensely sweet and rich, unlike anything from Italian baking. He tried all three, savoring each bite, knowing this was a meal he would remember for the rest of his life. When the meal finally ended, Antonio felt uncomfortably full, a sensation he had almost forgotten was possible. The prisoners filed out slowly, many pausing to thank the kitchen staff, to express amazement at what they had experienced. That evening, Antonio and his friends gathered in their usual spot, a quiet corner of the barracks where they could talk privately. Marco spoke first, his voice uncharacteristically serious. He said that he had spent 6 months hating Americans, seeing them as the enemy who had destroyed his life, taken his freedom, separated him from his family. But today, those same Americans had fed him better than he had eaten in years, had treated him with dignity and respect, had shown him kindness he did not deserve, and had not expected. It confused him, Marco admitted, made him question everything he thought he knew about this war. Luca agreed, adding that in Italy they had been told that Americans were cruel, that they tortured prisoners, that they were barbarians interested only in conquest and wealth, but the reality he had experienced was completely different. These Americans worked hard, they had discipline and organization, but they also had a generosity that seemed to come from genuine belief that even enemies deserved basic humanity. Father Domenico had the most complex reaction. As a priest, he had spent years contemplating questions of good and evil, sin and redemption, justice and mercy. He said that what troubled him most about Thanksgiving was not the food itself, but what it represented. The Americans had abundance in the middle of war, resources they could spare to feed prisoners lavishly, while their own soldiers fought and died on distant battlefields. This spoke to an economic power so vast, it was almost incomprehensible, but more than that, it spoke to a philosophy fundamentally different from European thinking. Europe, including Italy, operated from assumptions of scarcity, resources were limited, so they must be hoarded, protected, fought over. America seemed to operate from assumptions of abundance, there was enough for everyone, so sharing was not weakness but strength. This Thanksgiving dinner was not charity or propaganda, Father Domenico believed. It was an expression of national character, a demonstration that America's power came not just from factories and farms, but from beliefs about human dignity and potential. Antonio listened to his friends, wrestling with his own thoughts and feelings. He admitted that he felt guilty for enjoying the meal so much, guilty for feeling gratitude toward his captors, guilty for seeing Americans as human beings rather than abstract enemies. But he could not deny what he had experienced. The Americans had not needed to feed them this way. They could have provided minimum rations as specified by Geneva Convention, and no one would have criticized them. Instead, they had chosen abundance, had shared their national celebration with men who had fought against them months earlier. Antonio said he did not understand it, but he was grateful for it, and that gratitude scared him because it complicated his understanding of this war and his place in it. The days after Thanksgiving felt different in Camp Hearne. The feast had cracked something open in the prisoners' consciousness, had made them see their captors through a new lens. Relations between guards and prisoners became warmer, more human. Language barriers began to break down, as Italians learned more English, and Americans picked up basic Italian phrases. Work details became opportunities for conversation rather than silent drudgery. Some guards brought in magazines and newspapers for prisoners who could read English. Others organized informal sports competitions, soccer matches between prisoners and guards that became surprisingly competitive and fun. The camp's atmosphere shifted from hostile to something approaching community, though everyone understood this was temporary, contingent on the war's continuation and eventual end. November became December. The Texas winter was mild compared to what Antonio remembered from northern Italy, but the nights grew cold enough to require extra blankets. On December 10th, Colonel Hayes made another announcement. In 2 weeks, the camp would celebrate Christmas. Again, a special meal would be prepared, though Hayes noted that Christmas dinner would be different from Thanksgiving, reflecting different traditions. Additionally, the camp would organize a Christmas Eve service in the chapel, open to all prisoners regardless of their religious convictions. Any prisoner who wished could submit requests for specific Italian foods or dishes that would help them feel connected to home traditions. The kitchen would do its best to accommodate these requests within available resources. This announcement generated even more discussion than Thanksgiving had. Christmas was deeply important to Italian culture, a religious and cultural celebration central to Italian identity. The prisoners began to hope that perhaps this Christmas would not be as lonely and devastating as they had feared. Antonio submitted a request through Corporal Tucker asking if the kitchen could make panettone, the traditional Italian Christmas bread from Milan. Tucker looked at Antonio's rough sketch and description, shook his head, and said he had no idea how to make such a thing, but if Antonio could figure it out with available ingredients, he would authorize it. This became Antonio's project for the next 2 weeks, recreating a taste of home using American supplies. Making panettone was challenging. The bread required candied fruits, particularly citron and orange peel, which were not available. Antonio improvised with raisins and dried apricots chopped fine. The bread needed a very light, airy texture achieved through careful kneading and long rising times. The camp kitchen schedule made this difficult, but Tucker adjusted work assignments to give Antonio time for the lengthy process. Antonio worked with an intensity bordering on obsession. This bread represented something more than food. It was a connection to his father's bakery, to Christmas mornings in Naples, to a life that felt increasingly distant and dreamlike. If he could create this bread here in a Texas prison camp, then perhaps he could hold on to hope that his old life still existed, that he would someday return to it. Father Domenico prepared for the Christmas Eve service with similar dedication. He had no formal vestments, no altar furnishings, no proper chalice for Mass, but he had faith, a small Bible, and a congregation desperately hungry for spiritual comfort. He recruited musically talented prisoners to form a choir, men who could remember Italian Christmas carols from childhood. They practiced in stolen moments, their voices carrying across the compound, triggering memories and tears in men who heard them. The guards allowed Father Domenico to construct a simple manger scene in the chapel, using scrap wood and basic tools. Prisoners contributed what they could, carved figures, painted details, created something beautiful from nothing. Christmas Eve arrived. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, unusual for Texas, and a light frost covered the ground. Antonio had finished his panettone the previous night, working until 2 in the morning to complete the baking. The loaves had risen beautifully, their domed tops golden brown, their texture light and delicate. He had made enough for each prisoner to receive a small slice, a taste of home. The Christmas Eve service was scheduled for 7 in the evening, to be followed by a midnight feast. Father Domenico had planned the service carefully, incorporating traditional Italian Christmas liturgy, as well as elements meaningful to men far from home. The chapel filled beyond capacity. Prisoners crowded inside, standing along the walls, sitting on the floor. Even some non-Catholic prisoners attended, drawn by the promise of community and remembrance. American guards stood respectfully at the back, some removing their caps, others bowing their heads. Father Domenico began the service with the traditional Christmas proclamation, his voice strong despite the inadequate surroundings. The choir sang Tun, Scendi delle Stelle, the beloved Italian Christmas carol, and throughout the chapel, men wept openly. Antonio stood with Marco and Luca, singing the familiar words, remembering Christmas Eves in Naples, when he would attend midnight mass with his parents, then return home to a feast of fish dishes, tradition required by Catholic custom. Father Domenico's homily spoke to the pain of separation, the agony of missing loved ones during this most family-oriented of holidays. But he also spoke of hope, of the Christmas message that light comes into darkness, that redemption is possible even in the deepest despair. He reminded them that the first Christmas had occurred under military occupation, that Mary and Joseph were refugees seeking shelter, that the Christ child was born among animals because no room existed for them among people. In this way, Father Domenico said, the prisoners shared something with the Holy Family. They too were displaced, far from home, dependent on the mercy of strangers, but just as God had not abandoned that family, neither had God abandoned them. This Christmas, celebrated in captivity, was nevertheless holy, was nevertheless real, was nevertheless worthy of joy despite the circumstances. The service concluded with prayers for families separated by war, for soldiers on all sides, for an end to conflict, for eventual peace and return home. As the final hymn faded, silence filled the chapel, broken only by quiet weeping. Men embraced each other, offering comfort, sharing grief and hope in equal measure. Then they filed out into the cold night, moving toward the mess hall where the Christmas feast awaited. Antonio entered the mess hall and once again found himself stunned by American generosity. The tables were decorated with evergreen branches, red ribbons, and candles creating a warm glow. The Christmas meal was different from Thanksgiving, but equally abundant. Roasted ham with pineapple glaze, a combination that again struck Antonio as strange but delicious. Roasted chicken for those who preferred it. Mashed potatoes and gravy again, apparently American staples. Roasted carrots and parsnips, fresh bread and butter, and special additions that acknowledged Italian traditions. Corporal Tucker had somehow procured ingredients to make a rough approximation of Italian Christmas dishes. There was bacalao, salt cod prepared in tomato sauce, a traditional Italian Christmas Eve dish. There was pasta with a simple marinara sauce, not authentic but recognizable. There were roasted chestnuts, triggering memories of street vendors in Italian cities, and prominently displayed on a central table were Antonio's panettone loaves, each one marked with a small Italian flag that Tucker had crafted from paper. The prisoners served themselves, their plates overflowing. Guards again assisted, ensuring everyone received generous portions. Colonel Hayes moved through the hall, shaking hands with prisoners, wishing the Buon Natale in carefully practiced Italian. The meal proceeded with laughter and conversation, men sharing stories of Christmas past, describing family traditions, naming loved ones far away. Antonio served slices of his panettone personally, accepting thanks and praise with humble nods. Men savored each bite, some closing their eyes to better recall memories the bread triggered. Marco declared it the best panettone he had ever tasted, obviously an exaggeration driven by sentiment, but Antonio appreciated the kindness. Luca ate his slice slowly, making it last, his face reflecting complex emotions. Father Domenico took his slice, and held it for a moment before eating, lips moving in silent prayer of gratitude. When midnight approached, the prisoners sang Christmas carols together, Italian songs of celebration and praise. The American guards listened respectfully, some joining in with English carols that blended with Italian voices in a musical demonstration of shared humanity. The Christmas celebration extended past midnight, prisoners reluctant to let the evening end. When they finally returned to their barracks, the cold Texas night felt less harsh, warmed by full stomachs and rekindled spirits. Antonio lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep despite exhaustion. The day had cracked something fundamental in his understanding of the world. He had expected to spend this Christmas in misery, mourning everything he had lost. Instead, he had experienced kindness from enemies, had felt genuine gratitude, despite captivity, had found community in the most unlikely place imaginable. The weeks following Christmas brought subtle but profound changes in camp dynamics. Prisoners who had maintained rigid emotional distance from their captors began to engage more openly. Language lessons became popular, Americans teaching English while Italians taught basic Italian phrases. Some guards brought personal items to show prisoners, photographs of families, letters from sweethearts, small tokens that revealed their own humanity. The barriers that had defined relationships between captor and captive began to dissolve, replaced by something more complex and ultimately more human. Antonio continued working in the kitchen, his relationship with Corporal Tucker deepening into genuine friendship. They spent hours discussing food, culture, their lives before war had disrupted everything. Tucker told Antonio about growing up in Louisiana, about his grandmother who had been enslaved until emancipation, about the racism he faced even while serving his country. Antonio shared stories of Naples, of his family's bakery, of the life he hoped to return to when war finally ended. These conversations revealed how much they had in common despite coming from vastly different worlds. Marco found purpose working in the camp garden, coaxing vegetables from Texas soil with techniques learned from his fisherman father. He discovered that growing food gave him a sense of control in circumstances where control seemed impossible. Luca's mechanical skills made him valuable to the American motor pool, and he took pride in keeping equipment running efficiently. Father Domenico's chapel became a gathering place not just for religious services but for counseling, education, and community building. The four friends maintained their evening meetings, processing their experiences, supporting each other through moments of despair and hope. Spring arrived in 1944, bringing wildflowers to the Texas prairie and news from Europe that the war was turning decisively against Germany. Allied forces had landed at Anzio in January, fighting their way up the Italian peninsula against fierce German resistance. Rome fell to Allied forces on June 4, just 2 days before D-Day landings in Normandy. The prisoners followed these developments through newspapers and radio broadcasts, their emotions conflicted. They wanted the war to end, wanted to go home, but the news meant their homeland was a battlefield, their families potentially in danger. Letters from home remained rare and heavily censored, but when they arrived, they were treasured beyond measure. Antonio finally received a letter from his mother in April 1944, the first communication in nearly a year. Francesca wrote that the bakery had been damaged during Allied bombing raids, but Giuseppe was attempting repairs. Food was scarce, everything rationed severely. Maria had married another man, a policeman who had been exempted from military service. Francesca did not blame the girl, she wrote. Everyone did what they must to survive. She prayed daily for Antonio's safety and return. The letter devastated Antonio even as it relieved him to know his parents lived. Maria's marriage hurt more than he expected, though rationally he understood. He had been gone for years, might never return. She had made a practical choice. The news about Maria forced Antonio to confront questions he had avoided. What would his life look like after the war? Could he return to the bakery and resume the existence he had left behind? The experiences of the past years had changed him fundamentally. He had killed men, had survived combat and captivity, had learned truths about the world that made simple return impossible. The boy who had kneaded dough in Naples no longer existed. In his place was a man who had seen too much, understood too much about human capacity for both cruelty and kindness. Summer brought oppressive heat, but also increased work opportunities. Many prisoners volunteered for agricultural work details, helping Texas farmers with harvests, while guards watched from a distance. The pay was minimal, camp script that could purchase small luxuries from the canteen, but the work provided purpose and a break from camp monotony. Antonio joined these details when kitchen duties allowed, finding satisfaction in physical labor under open sky. The farmers they worked for treated them with wary respect, occasionally sharing cold water or shade, recognizing that these Italians were just men trying to survive circumstances beyond their control. August brought news that stunned everyone. Paris had been liberated on August 25. Allied forces were sweeping across France, pushing toward Germany's borders. In Italy, Allied armies continued advancing despite stubborn German resistance. The end seemed finally approaching, though how long remained uncertain. In the Pacific, American forces were island-hopping toward Japan, each battle bringing them closer to the enemy homeland. The prisoners began to seriously discuss what would happen when war ended. Would they be repatriated immediately? Would they be held until formal peace treaties were signed? Would there be work opportunities in America for those who did not wish to return to a devastated Italy? These conversations revealed deep divisions among prisoners. Some desperately wanted to return home regardless of conditions, driven by loyalty to family and homeland. Others saw opportunities in America, imagined building new lives in a country that seemed to offer possibilities impossible in war-ravaged Europe. Still others felt trapped between worlds, no longer fully Italian but certainly not American, belonging nowhere completely. Antonio found himself in this last group, torn between duty to family and attraction to the freedom he sensed in American culture. Fall arrived again, completing a full year since the Thanksgiving that had changed everything. Colonel Hayes announced that the camp would again celebrate Thanksgiving with a traditional feast. This year, however, prisoners would help plan the menu, incorporating both American and Italian dishes to create a hybrid celebration. Antonio worked with Tucker to design a meal that honored both traditions: roasted turkey alongside braised rabbit, American stuffing alongside Italian risotto, pumpkin pie alongside panna cotta. The preparation became a collaborative project, Americans and Italians working together to create something neither could have achieved alone. The 1944 Thanksgiving exceeded even the previous year's celebration. The food was abundant and delicious, but more important was the atmosphere of genuine camaraderie. Guards and prisoners ate together, shared stories, laughed at jokes that crossed language barriers. Colonel Hayes gave a speech thanking everyone for making the camp a place of dignity despite difficult circumstances. He acknowledged that while they remained technically enemies, they had also become something else, men who had learned to see each other's humanity. This Thanksgiving, Hayes said, they could all be grateful for the reminder that even war could not completely destroy human capacity for connection and kindness. December brought the second wartime Christmas. The celebration followed the pattern established the previous year: Christmas Eve service, followed by a feast blending traditions. But this year carried added poignancy because everyone sensed it might be the last Christmas in captivity. The war in Europe was clearly ending. Germany was being crushed between advancing Allied armies from east and west. Italy had been largely liberated, though fighting continued in the north. The prisoners sang carols with voices stronger than the previous year, hope displacing despair, confidence replacing. Antonio's panettone was even better than his first attempt, technique refined through practice, each loaf a small masterpiece. Father Domenico's Christmas homily spoke of transformation, of how suffering could either destroy people or refine them like gold in fire. He reminded them that they had entered this camp as defeated soldiers, bitter and angry. But through the kindness they had experienced, through the friendships they had formed, through the work they had done, and the community they had built, they had been transformed. They would leave this place as different men, carrying lessons about human dignity and possibility that would shape the rest of their lives. This was the unexpected gift of captivity. Father Domenico said, the discovery that even in defeat and imprisonment, grace could find them. Winter turned to spring of 1945. On May 8, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The camp erupted in chaotic celebration, prisoners and guards alike, relieved that the killing had finally stopped. But celebration was tempered by uncertainty about what came next. The prisoners were no longer enemies, but neither were they free. Repatriation would take months, possibly years. Italy was devastated, infrastructure destroyed, economy collapsed, government struggling to establish legitimacy. Many prisoners chose to remain in America when offered the option, accepting contracts to continue agricultural work while applying for eventual immigration status. Antonio faced the hardest decision of his life. His parents needed him, the bakery needed rebuilding, family obligations called him home. But America offered possibilities that Italy could not. Tucker had spoken to Antonio about remaining in Texas, had offered to help him find work, had suggested that a skilled baker could thrive in American cities hungry for European cuisine. Marco was staying, had already signed a contract to work on a ranch in West Texas. Luca was returning to Italy, felt obligated to rebuild the factory where he had worked before conscription. Father Domenico was returning to Rome, was needed to help with massive reconstruction of church infrastructure. After weeks of agonizing thought, Antonio decided to return to Italy. Family duty outweighed personal preference. His parents were aging and needed his help, but he promised Tucker he would return to America if circumstances allowed, would seek the opportunities that had tantalized him during captivity. They embraced when Antonio finally departed Camp Hearne in August 1945, two men from impossibly different backgrounds who had formed a bond that transcended the categories that supposedly divided them. Tucker gave Antonio his address in Louisiana, made him promise to write, to stay in contact, to remember that he had a friend in America. The voyage back to Italy reversed the journey Antonio had taken 2 years earlier. The ship was crowded with returning Italian prisoners, all of them changed by their experiences, all facing uncertain futures. They arrived at Naples in September 1945 to find a city transformed by war. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble by bombing. The port facilities were destroyed and being rebuilt. People looked thin and worn, clothes patched and repatched, eyes carrying the weight of years of suffering. Antonio made his way through streets he barely recognized, searching for his family's bakery. He found it still standing but badly damaged. The front wall had been partially destroyed by a near miss, the interior gutted by looters. But his parents were alive, older and frailer than he remembered, but alive. Francesca wept when she saw him, unable to speak for several minutes. Giuseppe embraced his son silently, tears running down weathered cheeks. They rebuilt the bakery together over the following months, Antonio bringing techniques learned from Corporal Tucker, adapting American efficiency to Italian tradition. The work was hard, resources scarce, but it gave purpose to days that might otherwise have been consumed by grief for lost years. Antonio never forgot his time at Camp Hearne. He wrote letters to Tucker regularly, maintaining a friendship across distance and difference. He told stories of Thanksgiving and Christmas feasts to anyone who would listen, describing the unexpected kindness that had saved his sanity during captivity. Years later, in 1960, Antonio finally saved enough money to return to America for a visit. He traveled to Louisiana, met Tucker's family, spent 2 weeks experiencing American hospitality as a free man. Tucker had opened his own restaurant, was thriving, had never forgotten his Italian friend. The two men toured the region together, revisiting memories, marveling at how their lives had unfolded from that chance meeting in a prison camp kitchen. They visited Camp Hearne, now abandoned and falling into decay, and stood together in the space where the mess hall had been, remembering meals that had changed their understanding of friendship, enemy and humanity. They promised to stay in contact, to visit again, to never forget what they had learned about the possibility of connection across divisions that seemed insurmountable. Antonio returned to Naples carrying renewed appreciation for both his Italian heritage and the American values he had encountered during captivity. He eventually married, had children, taught them to make bread while telling stories of a Texas prison camp where enemies became friends over shared meals. His bakery thrived, became a neighborhood institution, survived into the next generation when his son took over operations. Antonio lived until 1992, dying peacefully at age 77, his final words a prayer of gratitude for the unexpected blessings that had emerged from the worst period of his life. The story of Italian prisoners, shocked by American Thanksgiving and Christmas feasts, became part of family lore, passed down through generations. Antonio's grandchildren would ask him to repeat the stories, to describe the food, to explain how enemies could treat each other with such dignity. He would tell them that war brought out both the worst and best in human nature, that the same species capable of terrible violence was also capable of extraordinary kindness. The meals he had experienced at Camp Hearne had taught him that humanity was not defined by nationality or uniform, but by choices made in moments when cruelty would have been easier than compassion. Marco remained in Texas, married an American woman, raised a family on the ranch where he had worked after the war. He and Antonio corresponded for decades, their letters chronicles of lives transformed by captivity turned friendship. Luca returned to his factory in Turin, became a union leader, fought for worker rights, never forgot lessons learned about dignity and respect during imprisonment. Father Domenico served in various parishes around Rome, eventually becoming a bishop, always remembering the Christmas Eve services in a Texas prison camp where faith had. The four friends reunited once, in 1975, 30 years after the war's end. They met in Rome, old men now, their faces lined with decades of experience. They visited monuments to the war dead, offered prayers for all who had suffered, reflected on how their lives had been shaped by those years of captivity. They talked late into the night, remembering Thanksgiving turkey and Christmas panettone, remembering guards who became friends, remembering lessons about human possibility learned in the unlikeliest of classrooms. Colonel Hayes lived until 1968, never forgetting Camp Hearne, or the men he had commanded there. In his final years he received letters from former prisoners, thanking him for treating them with dignity when he could have chosen otherwise. He kept these letters in a special folder, reading them when doubt crept in about whether his life had mattered. The letters assured him it had, that small acts of kindness rippled outward in ways impossible to fully measure, that treating enemies as human beings had changed lives across oceans and decades. Corporal Tucker's restaurant in Louisiana became famous for its fusion of Southern and Italian cuisine, an unlikely combination that reflected his friendship with Antonio. He displayed a photograph on the restaurant wall showing himself and Antonio in the Camp Hearne kitchen, two young men who had found common ground over shared love of food. Customers would ask about the photo, and Tucker would tell the story, always emphasizing that the meals they had prepared together had been more than food, they had been acts of bridge building across divisions that war created but could not make permanent. The site of Camp Hearne slowly disappeared, reclaimed by the Texas prairie. The barracks rotted and collapsed, the fences rusted away, the guard towers fell, nature erased physical evidence of the camp's existence, but the memories remained in the minds of men who had lived there, and in the stories they told their families. In 1982, a historical marker was erected on the site, acknowledging the camp's existence and its role in housing thousands of Axis prisoners during World War II. The marker mentioned that the camp had been known for humane treatment of prisoners, that relationships formed there had outlasted the war itself. Antonio's story represents thousands of similar stories, Italian and German prisoners, scattered across American camps from 1943 to 1946, men who experienced unexpected kindness during captivity. Many chose to remain in America after the war, building lives and families, contributing to American culture and economy. Others returned to devastated homelands, carrying memories of American abundance and generosity. All were changed by experiences that challenged assumptions about enemies and humanity. The Thanksgiving and Christmas feasts at Camp Hearne were not unique. Across America, camp commanders made similar decisions to share holiday celebrations with prisoners, believing that maintaining dignity even in captivity reflected core American values. These meals served multiple purposes. They maintained morale among prisoners, reducing disciplinary problems. They demonstrated American abundance in ways that impressed captives and perhaps served as subtle propaganda. But most importantly, they insisted that even war could not completely erase human decency, that treating enemies as people rather than objects was both morally correct and practically effective. The Geneva Conventions required only that prisoners receive adequate nutrition. The Americans could have provided minimum rations and fulfilled their legal obligations. Instead, they chose generosity, shared their national celebrations, treated defeated enemies as guests. This decision reflected something distinctive about American culture in that era, a confidence born of abundance, a belief that there was enough for everyone, that sharing diminished nothing. Whether this reflected genuine moral conviction or simply the privilege of a nation untouched by bombing and invasion remains debatable. But for men like Antonio Russo, the motivation mattered less than the reality of the kindness received. The legacy of Camp Hearne and places like it extended far beyond the individuals who experienced them. The prisoners who returned to Italy and Germany carried stories of American treatment, stories that shaped post-war attitudes and contributed to reconciliation. The Americans who served as guards learned that enemies were human beings, lessons that influenced how they viewed subsequent conflicts and international relations. The meals shared across divides of nationality and war became symbols of possibility, proof that even the deepest divisions could be bridged through simple acts of recognition and respect. Antonio never forgot the moment he walked into the mess hall on that first Thanksgiving and saw tables laden with more food than he had seen in years. The memory remained vivid decades later, the smell of roasted turkey, the taste of pumpkin pie, the sight of American guards serving Italian prisoners with genuine care. In that moment something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the world. He had learned that enemies could become friends, that kindness could flourish even in circumstances defined by conflict, that humanity persisted even when systems tried to erase it. The story ends where it began, with Antonio standing at the fence, looking out at an unfamiliar landscape, trying to understand his place in a world transformed by war. But if the beginning found him filled with confusion and bitterness, the end finds him filled with gratitude and hope. The meals he shared at Camp Hearne had taught him that even in the darkest circumstances, light could break through, that even when systems insisted on empty, individuals could choose connection. This lesson sustained him through decades of life, shaped how he treated others, influenced the values he passed to children and grandchildren. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.